It was an amazing discovery, or rather, rediscovery. For centuries, scholars assumed that the letter on self-control was a work of Basil of Caesarea, a 4th century church father, one of the architects of the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity. After all, the letter is directly attributed to Basil and is found in manuscripts containing his works. Based mostly on the content of the letter, however, some modern scholars doubted that Basil was the true author. So they began referring to the letter's author as Pseudo-Basil. Scholars knew that a passage in this letter agreed word for word with a passage cited by Clement of Alexandria and attributed directly to Valentinus. This is the famous passage which says that Jesus could not contain corruption. Therefore, he did not produce waste. So Jesus is the great exception to that children's book title, Everyone Poops. As it turns out, if you are a God in flesh, your body does not produce rancid matter. Jesus eats food, to be sure, but everything nicely burns away or evaporates inside of him. It's a fascinating idea, and it should not be considered unorthodox. The idea was supported, for instance, by Epiphanius of Salamis, the 4th century bishop and heresiologist. It was also evidently supported in part, at least, by Clement, who thought that Jesus only ate food to put on a show. His divine body did not actually need glucose to run itself. In 2024, Nathan Porter has made the case that the entire letter on self-control should be attributed not to Basil or Pseudo-Basil, but to Valentinus himself. And in this video, I want to explain why I find this case to be compelling. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and in this channel, I discuss topics on the Greco-Roman world, New Testament, and Gnosis. I depend now entirely on your support to keep the channel going. I work hard to make good content available to you for free. If you have benefited, consider joining me on Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by taking a course with me. All the links are in the description. It is indeed the case that some works of heretics were saved by being attributed to orthodox writers. Valentinus wrote several sermons and letters, as we know from Clement of Alexandria. He is the reputed author of a psalm book, and some scholars, especially in the past, propose that Valentinus is the author of the Gospel of Truth. For the most part, however, the works of Valentinus have all decayed or were destroyed because, by the 4th century at least, he was widely viewed as a heretic. But if someone in the 5th or 6th century thought that his works, or one of them, were worth saving, then this work could be reattributed to a different author and squirreled away in that author's writings. Thus, Porter's hypothesis that Valentinus wrote the letter on self-control is perfectly possible. But why shouldn't we follow the previous consensus that the author of this letter was just using or reusing the writings of Clement, who quoted Valentinus? Well, as Porter points out, the letter shows no clear signs of literary seams. It manifests considerable internal unity and argumentative coherence. Everything fits together. But when we turn to Clement, bits and pieces of the letter on self-control show up in the stromata in different places without attribution. Individual words or phrases pop up. Sometimes they pop up twice with slight and trivial changes. As Annelies van den Hoek shows, this is a sure sign of Clement's citation technique. What Clement often did, that is, was to take a source, paraphrase part of it, perhaps quote another section of it with a name, then to continue to paraphrase, adding his own comments without attributing the material to anyone. Often he would skip around in a source, pulling language from different sections, reweaving them into his own prose, so that the original meaning of the language was changed and even distorted. Porter shows that this is exactly how Clement operates when he takes the letter on self-control. He tweaks some of the language and reuses it as his own. He offers then a direct quote of Valentinus, and after this direct quote, he returns to paraphrasing. He paraphrases some of the passages twice in slightly different language. So we have two scenarios in front of us. Either Clement used the letter in his characteristic way, or the author of Self-Control was using Clement to compose the letter. But in the latter case, that task would be very difficult, if not impossible. The author would need to pull from various sections of Clement, combine passages, make the language consistent, and turn random reflections into a coherent argument with a coherent theme. It's much more likely that Clement was prodigally pulling from the letter, chopping it up, repeating some phrases of interest, and overall making it a part of his own prose. Moreover, as Porter points out, Clement's texts show literary marks of copying that are not present in the letter on self-control. First of all, Clement mixes up different portions of the letter, citing only material that interested him. He misread or miscopied some of the words and added his own remarks that don't represent the content of the letter. For example, Clement introduces his quote from Valentinus with the phrase that Jesus endured all things, panta hupomenos. But this phrase, interestingly, is not found in the letter on self-control. It might possibly be Clement's attempt to paraphrase an idea he thought was in the letter, but it's better to think that Clement added this phrase to accentuate Jesus' moral control over his body. Jesus showed voluntary self-restraint. He changed his digestion by means of his self-control. But this point is not at all clear in the letter on self-control itself. Of course, it does mention that Jesus had internal self-control and that this self-control was a great power. But self-control is seen primarily as a divine gift, not as the result of endurance or moral fortitude. Clement also simplified the language of the original letter. Whereas the letter said, so great a power was his inner self-control, Clement wrote, so great was the power of his self-control. This Clementine phrasing is easier to understand and probably represents an attempt to smooth out a more difficult reading, the reading of self-control as a power. I think that these arguments are basically compelling and that we should attribute or reattribute the letter on self-control to Valentinus. There's no need to search for another author because Clement clearly says that the author of the text he quotes was Valentinus. One could imagine a third source for both Clement and the letter, but the simplest explanation is that Clement was pulling from the letter directly. The whole letter was then removed from Valentinus and attributed at some point to Basil of Caesarea. That attribution made sense because the letter was on self-control, and Basil was known as a writer on ascetic topics, and he even produced a guidebook for monastic life. This would mean that the letter on self-control was originally addressed to Agathopus, evidently an acquaintance of Valentinus. The heading of the letter and its initial line seem to have been modified by a scribe, but there seems to be no reason to deny that we have about 99% of Valentinus's original letter to Agathopus, who must have asked Valentinus to write and send him a meditation on self-control. To read my translation of this letter in the context of Valentinus's fragments, I want to encourage everyone to take my course on Valentinus. Here you'll get my full commentary on all the fragments and this letter specifically. The link is in the description. For what remains, I'd like to touch on some other features of the letter which are of interest. Valentinus's letter refers to what could be interpreted as a spirit body. He says that self-control departs from everything mortal as if it had God's spirit as a body. It's easy to think here of Eastern Valentinian Christology, according to which Christ receives a spirit body at his baptism. Here one should note, however, that having God's spirit as a body is not necessarily the same as having a spiritual or spirit body. Moreover, Valentinus does not say that Jesus alone had God's spirit as a body, but that self-control itself has a body made up of God's spirit. It's certainly an odd way of talking. Valentinus may have meant to say that anyone who perfects self-control can obtain God's spirit as a body. For modern people, it's hard to conceive of spirit as a body. The word translating spirit here is pneuma, and pneuma in antiquity could be thought of as a highly refined and fiery substance. It was the best kind of body, and was often thought of as the body of the stars. Now God is pneuma, and the one who clings to the Lord is one pneuma with him, according to Paul. Perhaps such passages of Scripture led Valentinus to think that one could assume God's pneuma as a body, provided that one perfected self-control. Valentinus even identified self-control with God himself. By implication, Jesus, who manifested self-control, gained God's spirit as a body. After all, both God and Jesus are identified with self-control. Another interesting passage regards aeons. According to later Valentinian thought, or rather Ptolemaic thought, God emanated a series of aeons in an 8-10-12 pattern. Before the attribution of on-self-control to Valentinus, we had only one example of Valentinus using the word aeon. In fragment 5, our cosmos is contrasted with the quote-unquote living aeon. An aeon in this passage can fairly be translated by realm or world. The living aeon is the noetic world, and our world is the world of phenomena. In short, Valentinus used aeon in the singular, and he did not refer to the eternal thoughts or attributes of God. In On Self-Control, however, we find aeons in the plural. Valentinus says, if we have a little self-control and don't fall in love with mortal life, but with the upper aeons, we will be found up there where we send up our higher consciousness. Here again, aeons could simply refer to realms. They are up there in heaven. So evidently they are the heavenly realms. Now, they also could indicate the eternal emanations of God, and that's perfectly possible. But again, we need not understand them in this way. As previously mentioned, Valentinus in his letter says that self-control is a gift of God. The word for gift in Greek is charis. In later Valentinian thought, charis was a name for God's consort. Accordingly, Porter thinks that Valentinus was already referring to charis as the Father's consort. So he translates the phrase, charis is God's continence. I don't actually consider this interpretation likely, since it imports notions attributed to later Valentinians back to Valentinus himself. But Porter makes some significant contributions by pointing out parallels between On Self-Control and the Gospel of Truth. In the letter on self-control, we have this line that we will be found where we send up our higher consciousness. Literally, our nous. And a very similar statement is made in the Gospel of Truth. For they send up their thought to where their root is, the root which carries them above all the heights of the Father. In both cases, the place where we send up our nous or our thought is heaven or the higher realm. Also in the letter on self-control, we find the sentence that each word or phrase has a deeper meaning. Literally, each word has a nous. And the Gospel of Truth remarks that each letter which God reveals to the aeons is a complete thought. I think that these parallels strengthen the case that Valentinus actually was the author of the Gospel of Truth. Finally, I'll say a brief word about the passage which occurs immediately before the comment about Jesus' divine digestion. Valentinus says that Jesus was manifest as self-control when he became light over land and sea. Neither earth nor ocean supported him, but just as he tread on the sea, so he did not weigh down the earth. Jesus becoming light over land and sea translates the Greek word kouphos. Porter translates this word by nimble, but I think it means more than that here. Valentinus was manifestly thinking of the passage in the Gospels when Jesus walked on water. At least on this occasion, Jesus' body did not obey the law of physics. It was effectively weightless as it moved over the water. And Valentinus deduced that the weightless nature of Jesus' body was actually his permanent state. Just as Jesus walked on water, so also he walked on land. In modern terms, the forces of gravity did not apply to Jesus, so he did not actually weigh down the earth. The closest parallel to this notion occurs in the Acts of John 93, where John testifies that Jesus did not make footprints in the ground and that he hovered slightly over the earth. Apparently, in the 2nd century, this was a perfectly possible and plausible view for a Christian to have about Jesus' body. It was a real body, of course, but it was weightless. Apparently, Clement liked the part about Jesus' divine digestion, but he didn't like Jesus' weightless walking or gliding over land and sea, so he omitted this remark. Even though Valentinus asserted the weightlessness of Jesus' body, it would be wrong to think that for Valentinus, Jesus' body was not real. It was perfectly real. It was just not limited by human weakness and corruption. It could not contain corruption, so it did not produce rancid matter. It was a body that could walk on water, so it must have been weightless. Valentinus was evidently connecting the dots from the gospel. He believed that Jesus had a body, just that it was a divine or special body. Perhaps he thought that Jesus' body did consist of God's pneuma. That would certainly explain its light and airy nature. This is not Docetism. It's rather the ancient idea of the communication of properties. Jesus was a God in flesh, so the properties of his divinity changed the nature of his fleshly body. You might think that Valentinus was wrong, but in his own mind, he evidently believed that he was honoring Jesus and merely drawing out the implications of the Gospels. Now, I highly encourage everyone to read the full letter of Valentinus in its context. It's amazing. And again, with it, you can take my full course on Valentinus, where I focus on his authentic writings. I'll also put my translation of the letter on my Patreon. I hope that you'll take advantage of these resources and support me in my mission to make good and reliable scholarship available. I can attest that Valentinus was an incredibly deep and interesting thinker. His individual words and phrases are deep, and they contain mysteries fit only for your higher consciousness.